The US Supreme Court heard arguments on Tuesday in their ongoing decision that will decide the future of the abortion pill Mifepristone. The case is FDA versus Alliance for Hippocratic Medicine, which will determine whether the drug can be banned.
The justices overall seem skeptical of the attempts to limit access to Mifepristone. According to the Washington Post, a majority of justices on both sides of the aisle questioned whether the anti-abortion doctors challenging the pill had the legal grounds to bring forth a lawsuit. Now, SCOTUS will review the Texas court's decision to restrict access to the abortion drug, and a decision that is expected to come by this summer. Joining us now to break it down is the Hill's courts and legal reporter, Zach Schonfeld. Thank you so much for joining us, Zach.
Good to be with you.
So why don't you give us an update about the tenor of the conversation? Obviously, we now have a Supreme Court that is majority conservative, majority appointed by Republican, had the infamous Roe reversal a few years ago. This is another abortion-related case, but it sounds like there was more skepticism this time, even coming from the conservative side.
That's right. This is the biggest abortion case to be back at the Supreme Court since they overturned Roe versus Wade. And when this case over the availability of the abortion pill Mifepristone got to the justices on Tuesday, we saw the justices in both ideological camps expressing skepticism, not necessarily on the merits of the availability of this drug, but instead we saw both liberal justices and conservative justices questioning whether the challengers in this case actually have legal standing, meaning can they actually bring this lawsuit in the first place. These plaintiffs have to show that they actually are suffering concrete harm because of Mifepristone's availability on the market. These are abortion doctors and anti-abortion rights groups that are bringing this challenge. And so we saw some of the justices, even some of Donald Trump's appointees on the high court, really questioning whether this lawsuit should have been brought in the first place.
And what was their argument, Zach? I don't want to get too deep into the weeds of the legal standing argument, but what was the argument made that they had in fact, or were in fact suffering damage or injury because of the situation with Mifepristone?
There have been a few different arguments put forth as this case has gone up and down through the court system. But generally speaking, these doctors are claiming that because they are morally opposed to abortion, that if this drug is allowed to stay on the market, that would cause some women who take this drug to suffer adverse consequences. They say that they'll have to go to the hospital, end up in the ER, and that these doctors would then be forced to treat these patients. And they are objecting to that on moral grounds. But what we saw from the Biden administration's lawyer, as well as a lawyer for the manufacturer of this drug, they said that causation chain is just too speculative. And if these plaintiffs are able to sue, according to the Biden administration, there's nothing to stop all these other plaintiffs and groups across the country from filing lawsuits, not only against the availability of Mifepristone, but they have argued that this would lead plaintiffs to be able to call into question a whole lot of other drugs that the FDA has approved.
And so we understand as well that the person arguing this case is Erin Hawley, who's actually the wife of Senator Josh Hawley. Can you tell us more about that?
That's right. She is the wife of Senator Josh Hawley. Josh Hawley, we should also note, was actually in the courtroom on Tuesday for the arguments to watch his wife argue this case. And she has been no stranger to some of these high-profile cases. She works for a group called Alliance Defending Freedom, which has been both behind this case, as well as a lot of other cases that are really in the culture wars, whether it be abortion, on LGBTQ protections, and all of these other cases. ADF, whether it be her or some of her other co-counsel, have been behind a lot of these lawsuits, including, for example, the big Supreme Court case last term involving gay wedding websites. So certainly this group is no stranger to the Supreme Court, and I think has been filing a lot of these challenges to really make these headlines and to get these cases before the 9 justices, in which they hope now, with the conservative bent, given that Donald Trump has been able to appoint 3 justices to the court, they're now hoping to score some big conservative victories here.
How is this playing out, given the reality that, I think some Republicans fear that abortion is a losing issue for them? The backlash to Roe was part of the reason for, according to the commentary, and I think some Republicans did, frankly, digest this messaging, that it's hurt them in some swing state elections, that it's, frankly, even hurt them in solidly red states. How is that backdrop playing out here?
Well, I think you have to look no further than the scene outside the Supreme Court during the oral arguments on Tuesday. There were hundreds of protesters out there. And I'll tell you, even in some of the other big cases that we've heard this term, I think this is arguably potentially the biggest group of demonstrations that we've seen for any Supreme Court argument this year. So certainly a lot of grassroots energy out there. There's a lot of activist groups on both sides trying to push the court. There have been dozens of amicus briefs filed in this case. So certainly a lot of attention. And when the court does ultimately rule, it'll likely come down by the end of June. It'll make this, a big case now as we head into the 2024 election season. So I think it certainly will be a campaign issue, whichever way the Supreme Court goes. Certainly something that we're likely to see in advertisements heading into November.
And just put a little bit of flesh on the bones of that point, Zach. I mean, in terms of the political ramifications or the political salience of this issue specifically, the Mifepristone issue, how big is that? Like, we understand, of course, that abortion's a massive issue, that reproductive rights writ large are a massive issue, but how do you see the political implications of this particular case playing out?
I think the political implications are quite large because of, after Roe was overturned, we have seen a lot of the cases have to do with, these laws that have been passed by certain Republican-led states. But this is a case, on the other hand, that's set to affect people who not only live in those red states, but also people who live in blue states. This case has the potential to ban mifepristone nationwide. And so I think, even for people who might live in, states like New York, where, I don't think the Democratic-led legislature is going to take any action to restrict abortion availability, this is still a case, despite who they have in power at the state government, that could really impact abortion access. This is a pill that is used now in more than half of abortions nationwide. So I think the political implications here just cannot be understated. Because
they're across the board, really. They are universal throughout the United States in a way that others aren't necessarily in the same way.
Absolutely. And another interesting thing at this argument was we saw from two of the conservative justices, Justices Clarence Thomas and Samuel Alito, on multiple occasions during this argument, they brought up a law called the Comto Act, which is a more than century-old law that bans the mailing of abortion drugs through the mail. Now, this is a statute because of Roe versus Wade. When that was on the books for many decades, this law had largely become obsolete. But now that Roe is gone, there's the question of whether the federal government can step in and start to enforce the Comto Act again and potentially, ban abortion that way. And I think what we saw from the questioning from these two conservative justices is that even if the Supreme Court, if the expectations are right, that in this case they preserve access to mifepristone, that means that there is still a potential way, if Donald Trump wins the White House in November, he could then direct his Justice Department potentially to start enforcing the Comto Act. So I think it very much is an open question, no matter what the Supreme Court does here, is to potentially to see the results of November on how that still could impact the access of mifepristone outside of the Supreme Court here.
Zach, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Good to be with you.